afternoon and welcome. My name is Shelby Magid, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you all for joining us for this event, co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center and Eurasia Center. I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Secretary Brent Neiman to the Council today. Assistant Secretary Neiman serves as the Assistant Secretary for International Finance at the Department of Treasury, where he focuses on a variety of international economic priorities, including the U.S.'s response to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and U.S. support for reconstruction efforts, IMF governance and programs, the World Bank, digital payments, and global financial regulation and supervision, among other critical topics. Assistant Secretary Neiman has been a leader on these key issues, and we're honored to have him here at the Atlantic Council, now to share his views on the economic front in Ukraine. As he will share, he just returned from Ukraine and will share firsthand his view of the economic reality on the ground. The Assistant Secretary is no stranger to the Atlantic Council. We also had the privilege of hosting him for the inaugural Transatlantic Forum on Geoeconomics in Berlin in 2022. Prior to this position, Assistant Secretary Neiman was a counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury, and before joining the Treasury Department, he was the Edward Eagle Brown Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, along with various other distinguished positions and studies in economics. Today, Assistant Secretary Neiman will address Ukraine's macroeconomic resilience, the nation's wartime economy, ongoing efforts for recovery and reconstruction, and the IMF's role in helping stabilize Ukraine's economy. Ukraine's economy has demonstrated remarkable resilience as Russia continues to wage its war on the Ukrainian nation. Throughout this time, the IMF has played a key role in supporting and stabilizing the Ukrainian economy, as has the U.S. government. Following the Assistant Secretary's speech, he'll join Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center Senior Fellow Martin Mühleisen for a conversation. Dr. Mühleisen has decades of experience in economic crisis management and financial diplomacy, and served as the Director of Strategy, Policy, and Review at the IMF, during which time he helped the IMF with the response to the COVID-19 crisis and represented the IMF in G7 and G20 communique discussions. He also served as Chief of Staff and Principal Advisor to Managing Director Christine Lagarde. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Neiman for your remarks. Assistant Secretary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for hosting me here today. For more than 60 years, the Atlantic Council has focused on promoting positive U.S. engagement around the world, which makes it a fitting venue for my remarks, which will focus on perhaps the defining international economics issue of President Biden's first term, Russia's war and our economic support for Ukraine. Just a few days ago, I returned from a visit to Kyiv. From afar, it can be easy to anesthetize the war with technical discussions of the violation of territorial integrity and international law and the undermining of the post-World War II international order brought by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. But up close, it's impossible to lose sight of how the lives of 40 million Ukrainians have forever changed. I spoke with many Ukrainians and heard their stories. Young adults terrified about enlisting and fighting. New parents exhausted but constantly tracking the time it'd take to get their kids to the closest bomb shelter. Everyone had lost a friend or a relative or knew someone who had. Russia's bombs and bullets have stolen children from their parents and have stolen parents from their children. As Secretary Yellen has emphasized, Ukraine's resistance against Russia is nothing short of heroic. Ukraine stands at the vanguard, defending the international order's norms against wars of conquest. And I'm proud that the United States saw a moral obligation to help. We quickly joined forces with partners and allies and immobilized Russia's sovereign assets in our jurisdictions. We imposed novel sanctions on Russia's imports and exports, and we sent many billions of dollars of weapons and defense support to Ukraine. And as I'll focus on today, I'm also proud of our work to help Ukraine shore up its economic front. In the first 2 years of the war, the United States gave $23 billion in direct budget support and $4 billion in recovery and reconstruction funds to Ukraine. And in late April of this year, the President, with support from an overwhelming bipartisan majority in Congress, signed the National Security Supplemental, which included nearly $10 billion more in direct budget support and other economic assistance. Economic assistance is often overshadowed by military support. But just as Ukraine's guns can't shoot back without bullets, its soldiers can't deploy without repaired roads, can't recover without functioning hospitals, and can't fully focus on their mission without knowing that their kids are in schools staffed by teachers and that their families have access to water and electricity. And as all Ukrainian tax revenues go to military spending, running the government and providing critical public services requires this kind of outside support. The ongoing provision of these critical services, coupled with Ukrainian determination, ingenuity, and even good humor, has enabled the economic and financial life of much of the country to continue. In Ukraine, I visited the Kyiv School of Economics, where they showed me a bomb shelter that was outfitted with a whiteboard so they could remain productive and discuss research even when sheltering from Russian attacks. And after hearing an air raid alert and seeking cover, we quickly got back to our business when a pre-recorded all clear was voiced by none other than Mark Hamill, complete with his advice to use the force. I met young professionals that run online trackers of Ukraine's war economy and use social media creatively to discuss war bonds and Ukraine's public finances. Russia's brutal war of aggression has cost them all enormously, and yet they're pouring their ambition, belief, creativity, and determination into securing a brighter future for their Ukraine. Walking along Raitarska Street in Kyiv, we stopped into a sportswear store called Riot Division that embodied the resilience of the Ukrainian people. The tags on their clothing say proudly, "Made in Ukraine during the wartime." As the war has extended over time, economic factors have become more salient, not less. Ukraine needs a successfully functioning economy to produce equipment, support soldiers on the battlefield, and allow civilians to stay in the country and make investments in its future. In the face of a devastating economic shock, Ukraine's macroeconomy has demonstrated that same resilience as I saw in its people. After Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's economy shrank by 30%, a decline that went faster and further than what the U.S. experienced during the Great Depression. In a country with a population of roughly 40 million, nearly 7 have become refugees in other countries, and 4 million more have been internally displaced. Hundreds of bridges, thousands of miles of roads, more than 1,500 schools, and almost 1/10 of all housing was destroyed. Maritime routes previously used to export Ukraine's enormous wheat harvests became war zones full of floating mines. Economies need labor and capital to produce, but after the attacks, Ukraine faced massive shortages of both. And yet, even while waging a successful military defense of its territory, Ukraine's economy nimbly absorbed and responded to this shock. Different goods and services are now needed, and existing goods are needed in different places. Household consumption, which was over 70% of GDP during 2020 and 2021, dropped to below 63% in the subsequent 2 years, while government's share more than doubled over that same period. Relatedly, concentrated production centers are more difficult to protect from missiles and drones, so output has expanded to where production is geographically diffuse and better sheltered, such as to IT services. Manufacturing's share of GDP dropped from 11% in 2020 to 2021 to 9% during 22 and 23. And whereas real construction activity in the final quarter of 2023 is at 61% of its level just before the war, information, communication, finance, and insurance activity has recovered to 96% of its pre-war quarterly level. To meet these new economic needs, Ukrainian entrepreneurs and managers are rapidly registering new businesses. The number of new registrations collapsed from 63,000 during the first quarter of 2021 to 47,000 during the first quarter of 2022, the start of the war, a drop of nearly a quarter. But these new business registrations have now fully recovered. And in fact, in the first quarter of 2024, they reached 74,000 above pre-war levels. They're also reacting to the new geography of commerce, with companies changing their place of registration about 19,000 times since the start of the war. And business people and others are traveling again to make this happen. Train passenger numbers, for example, are now back to pre-invasion levels. Ukraine's leadership even engineered a shift in trade routes after Russia pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. To keep its grain flowing to market, Ukraine has started using ports on the Danube River, which had not been used for this purpose before the war. And grain-carrying ships have started transiting through territorial waters of Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. Ukrainian authorities collaborated with private companies to establish an insurance mechanism for ships along these temporary corridors. Ukraine has also shifted from exporting many of its commodities by sea to now using trucks and trains. The banking and financial system has also successfully evolved to meet the moment. Following Russia's invasion, government officials delayed recognition of non-performing loans, opened an emergency unsecured financing facility, and tightened limits on withdrawals by Ukrainians abroad. But just 1 year later, many of these emergency measures were already being carefully unwound. To date, the majority of commercial bank branches remain operational. There have been no bank runs. Liquidity is ample, and the financial sector has repaid the emergency financing provided by the National Bank of Ukraine, or NBU, at the start of the war. When the war began, the NBU gave approval for Ukrainian banks to use cloud services backed by hardware located in the EU, UK, Canada, and the US to bolster their operational resilience. And it upgraded and hardened the domestic interbank payment system, which has continued to work reliably. The NBU has even worked with Ukraine's systemically important banks to devise a plan called power banking, which entails a series of protocols designed to allow the banking system to maintain critical operations if a blackout or major attack occurs. Participating banks have backup generators, and their customers can, if needed, access their accounts from another participating bank, an innovation that improves system-wide durability. Now, immediately after Russia's invasion, it was clear that Ukraine would face acute balance of payments pressure. Resources used for the production of tradable goods had to make way for mobilization efforts. And there was no safe and reliable access to ports. Agricultural inventories were stolen or destroyed, and the price of critical imports surged. So were it not for the unusual circumstances, the swift approval of a traditional IMF program with policy conditionality and funding to support macroeconomic adjustment would have been an obvious remedy. But Ukraine was in the midst of a hot war. The hostilities were the proximate cause of Ukraine's balance of payment pressures, not fiscal imprudence or unsustainable policies. And while there had been previous IMF programs in post-conflict war-torn countries, such as those in Croatia and Rwanda in the 90s, or in Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire in the 2000s, and there have been programs for countries fighting domestic insurgencies, like in Somalia in 2020, Ukraine clearly posed a different challenge. Relative to those countries, Ukraine's military spending was much higher, and in a war, monetary and exchange rate policies might not work the way we would normally expect. Finally, it might be unreasonable to ask policymakers to pursue macroeconomic targets when, understandably, success on the battlefield would trump any other goals. Given the uncertainty about the impact of the war on economic policymaking, the IMF did not initially approve a standard program. Instead, it took two steps relevant to Ukraine. First, it instituted a temporary food shock window that could provide immediate financing for countries experiencing acute food insecurity and related crises generated by Russia's war. Ukraine was the first country to access this window, tapping it for $1.3 billion in October of 2022. Other countries, like Malawi and Haiti, soon followed. Second, the IMF created something called a Program Monitoring with Board Involvement, or PMB arrangement, with Ukraine. No financial support was offered under the PMB, but it allowed the IMF staff to work with Ukrainian authorities to build a macro stabilization framework and it provided a platform for donor coordination. It also allowed Ukraine's economic policymakers to demonstrate that they were able to successfully deploy tools and course a trajectory for Ukraine's macro economy consistent with the PMB's framework. Ukraine's strong performance on the PMB, together with safeguards instituted under a new IMF policy to lend into circumstances with exceptionally high uncertainty, opened the door to an eventual agreement. In March 2023, Ukraine and the IMF agreed to a 4-year extended fund facility, or EFF, program with $15.6 billion in financing. It has helped a lot. Ukraine's economy grew 5% last year, exceeding the IMF's expectations. Inflation, which peaked at over 26%, is now below the NBU's target range of 4 to 6%. The NBU has taken some measured steps to allow a bit of flexibility in the value of Ukraine's currency, the hryvnia, and has accumulated $20 billion in reserves in less than 2 years, more than the target set by the IMF. Now, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. After such a staggering GDP decline as what was seen in 2022, we would expect some recovery and growth in 2023. And disappointingly, the NBU's growth estimate for 2024 was recently downgraded to only about 3%. One contributor to this downgrade is the very significant destruction the Russian attacks continue to bring to Ukraine's energy sector. Ukraine has lost about 8 gigawatts of power generating capacity, which is an amount in the ballpark of half of peak load. Walking the streets of Kyiv last week, I routinely saw mobile generators and heard about the difficulties of managing a business through a period with unscheduled rolling blackouts. Another contributor to the downgrade in growth forecasts is the ongoing labor shortage. While in Ukraine, I heard that some companies like McDonald's or Zara, which typically have access to large pools of possible hires, were having to use staffing firms to find workers for their stores. So there's a long way to go in an extremely challenging and difficult environment. But credit is no longer contracting, exports are recovering toward pre-war levels, and Ukraine's government has stabilized its economy under its program with the IMF. Now, the IMF's involvement in Ukraine also produced benefits for developing and emerging economies all over the world. Russia's war impeded the export of Ukraine's agricultural production and led food prices to spike. Countries such as Egypt, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Sri Lanka relied heavily on Ukrainian exports of wheat, maize, and sunflower oil. By helping support the stabilization and recovery of Ukraine's exports, the IMF program has been critical to restoring global food security. And on this, we also cannot be complacent. Russia quit the Black Sea Grain Initiative last year and rejected safe passage for food shipments out of Ukraine and to the rest of the world. Ukraine's friends and the international community must remain steadfast in allowing its agricultural products to make it out to the global market. Just last Friday, the IMF and Ukrainian authorities reached a staff-level agreement on the 4th review of their program, and it was another strong performance, which together with the PMB makes it 5 in a row. My office at Treasury oversees the U.S. relationship with the IMF. I look closely at a lot of programs. Many struggle. Ukraine's level of success is not common. Now, given how unusual Ukraine's circumstances were for an IMF program, it was only natural for there to be significant debate and discussion among staff, management, and major IMF shareholders on whether and how to move forward. And I'm proud of the leadership role the U.S. Treasury played in supporting an IMF program for Ukraine. The program, in addition to funding, has provided oversight, accountability, and technical assistance. It's been a crucial linchpin in Ukraine's macroeconomic stability. It shows how the IMF can roll up its sleeves, work creatively, and deliver tremendous impact even in extremely difficult or extremely uncertain situations, so long as it has a serious and committed partner. Now, Ukraine's prudent management of fiscal and monetary policies so far has left it with room to maneuver. And looking ahead, policymakers might carefully consider some additional economic tools and approaches that are commonly used in wartime economies. First, early in the war, Ukraine restricted imports of various non-essential goods as a way to preserve foreign reserves and strengthen its external position. But it has since relaxed these restrictions. So one possibility would be to increase tariffs on imports of luxury consumer goods like cars. Second, careful monetary policymaking by the NBU has contributed to a steep drop in inflation expectations and a stabilization of the hryvnia. As I mentioned, inflation in April was just 3% at an annual rate, making it the 7th straight month with inflation at or below the central bank's target range. Inflation expectations are well anchored at levels below peer economies that are not at war, and forecasts call for the relative stability of the hryvnia's value. Given these successes, if ever desired or needed to support recovery, bolster reserves, or facilitate a steady external adjustment, Ukraine's now in a position to, together with the IMF, consider additional flexibility in their approach to monetary and exchange rate policies. Third, as discussed, fiscal resources are even more essential in wartime economies. Academic research offers some tentative evidence that patriotism can support tax compliance. And indeed, personal income tax revenues in Ukraine rose from about 6.4% of GDP in 2021 to closer to 8% in 2022 to 2023. At a time of such common sacrifice, perhaps this partially reflects shifting norms and less social tolerance of tax evasion. Looking ahead, important additional possibilities include increasing the value-added tax rate and replacing the flat personal income tax with a more progressive system. These ideas and others are helpfully discussed in Ukraine's new national revenue strategy. Linking support to reforms. In addition to the United States and the IMF, Ukraine has received tremendous support from partners, particularly the European Union, Japan, Canada, the UK, and Norway. And this support has taken many forms, including military aid, grants, and concessional loans for Ukraine's public budget, spending to help the large wave of Ukraine's refugees seeking shelter in neighboring countries, and various programs led by the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD, and other official and multilateral development institutions. And this support is not only aimed at helping Ukraine defend itself during the war, it's also designed to help Ukraine transform itself into a fairer and more prosperous place after the war, with reduced corruption, increased transparency, and better governance. Now, to be clear, I believe the United States and the international community should help Ukraine defend itself against Russia's barbaric attacks, even if there were no scope for Ukraine to make these sorts of reforms. Nonetheless, this is an important opportunity to help Ukraine do both. To this end, budget assistance from the United States, Europe, and the international financial institutions is designed to help support Ukraine in undertaking a number of priority reforms. For example, Ukraine's enhanced the institutional autonomy of the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO, which is an independent unit of Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau and plays a critical role in the fight against corruption. It has an explicit mandate to prosecute criminal investigations. It's the teeth of Ukraine's anti-corruption apparatus. However, in order to be able to pursue powerful targets, SAPO needs to be as insulated from politics as possible. To this end, last fall, Ukraine's Prime Minister submitted legislation to the Rada to make SAPO a separate legal entity, to increase its staffing, and to change its bureaucratic structure to maximize accountability. For example, the legislation put non-prosecutorial staff under the direct authority of SAPO's head to discourage leaks, and also set in place transparent procedures to select leadership and mechanisms for it to be evaluated, including by external auditors. The Rada passed this legislation in December, capping off a year in which SAPO encouragingly issued 100 indictments for corruption. Ukraine's also restored the need for public officials to report their asset holdings and created a single pipeline for public projects that will be chosen through a competitive, digital, and transparent process. These reforms aim to reduce the likelihood for conflicts of interest and corruption, particularly as relates to public contracting and procurement. And Ukraine's recently developed national revenue strategy also places an important emphasis on accountable administration in both the state customs service and state tax service. Ukraine's also focused on corporate governance improvements at state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Legislation passed in February broadened the powers of SOE supervisory boards to include hiring and firing CEOs. The legislation also introduced competitive and transparent selection processes for the supervisory board members themselves and gave the Ministry of Finance an enhanced role over the financial reporting and accountability of SOEs to help mitigate fiscal risks. Several key Ukrainian SOEs operate in the energy sector, including Naftogaz, GTSO, and Ukrenergo, so their governance reforms are critical for efficiently rebuilding infrastructure desperately needed following Russian attacks. They also may accelerate Ukraine's integration with EU standards, which is consistent with Ukraine's goal of future EU accession. In addition to this more conventional support and its associated conditionality, Ukraine's G7 partners are also working hard in response to their leaders' declaration to look at all possible avenues by which immobilized Russian sovereign assets could be made use of to support Ukraine. The European Union recently decided that the annual flow of windfall profits earned from the investment of these immobilized assets, different from the assets themselves and not the property of Russia, that windfall will be used for Ukraine's aid. Now, on its own, this important and innovative approach would deliver billions per year to Ukraine. But we're now making progress with our partners in considering ways to build on this to deliver an even larger amount of funds to Ukraine right now. For example, one possibility may be to lend a significant amount up front to help Ukraine over the short run and link repayment of that loan to the stream of future windfall profits. This or a related approach would both provide immediate fiscal boost to Ukraine and also signal to Putin that he cannot simply outlast Ukraine and its partners. Further contributing to Ukraine's fiscal resources, official creditors, including the United States, agreed to a voluntary standstill on the repayment of $4 billion of official bilateral debt until March 2027. Private sector creditors also offered a debt standstill on 20 billion in Eurobonds, but that standstill will expire in less than 3 months on August 31st. The IMF program requires that debts owed to both official and private creditors are restructured in a way that restores debt sustainability and respects comparability of treatment. We hope that Ukraine and its bondholders agree soon to such a treatment. Historically, many countries have lost market access for extended periods of time in the wake of debt treatments. In Ukraine's case, their fiscal stress and debt suspension resulted from a brutal and illegal military attack on its soil well outside of Ukraine's own control. So as such, it seems likely to me that their debt suspension will be viewed differently by global investors than other cases in which default or a treatment resulted from unsustainable domestic policies or decisions that were within the borrower's control. So I'm hopeful that Ukraine will in short order regain the ability to issue debt to private investors on international markets. Now, Ukraine has managed its economy well. It's engaged productively with the IMF, and it has additional room to use various economic policy tools if needed. Supported and encouraged by the United States and allies around the globe, Ukraine's defending itself militarily and enacting reforms to improve governance, put its fiscal trajectory on a better footing, and root out corruption. We can't lose focus on Ukraine's urgent needs and the immediacy of very severe and serious threats against it. But we can and should at the same time help Ukraine plan for, and where appropriate, get moving on its recovery and reconstruction. The World Bank's third rapid damage and needs assessment estimated that at the end of 2023, reconstruction and recovery will require nearly $500 billion of spending over the course of a decade. And this estimate excludes the damage recently inflicted by Russia's attacks over the past few months on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, where needs are highest. Major investment needs also exist in housing, in transport, commerce and industry, and agriculture. The international community, in cooperation with the government of Ukraine, have established the Multi-Agency Donor Coordination Platform, or MDCP, to help prioritize and coordinate critical program assistance in these areas. The MDCP will reconvene on the margins of next week's Ukraine Recovery Conference, hosted in Berlin. Private investment from firms all over the world will also need to play a critical role in Ukraine's recovery. The German agricultural company Bayer recently started construction on a new $65 million factory in Ukraine, and American agricultural firms like ADM and Cargill are also investing and reinvesting in Ukraine. Creative public and private sector initiatives may pave the way for more such activity. For example, the insurer, Marsh McLennan, announced a number of initiatives aimed at reducing or helping foreign firms manage war-related risks, including the development of a framework for a public-private risk pool, the provision of insurance for the new marine cargo and war facility focused on grain and other vital food supplies, and a data risk platform to help insurers assess risks to make it easier to enter the market. The World Bank's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, has provided Ukraine with almost $200 million in guarantees to support private sector activity. And in 2022 to 23, the EBRD provided $550 million in financial support to Ukrenergo to make emergency repairs of damage caused by Russia's heavy bombing of civilian power infrastructure, and to support its continued functioning, including renewables. Last December, EBRD shareholders approved a €4 billion capital increase for the bank that will allow it to support up to €3 billion in annual investment in Ukraine during reconstruction, while sustaining investments in neighboring countries and others still experiencing spillovers. As the United States is the largest shareholder of EBRD, it's vital that Congress authorize and fund U.S. participation in the capital increase requested as part of the President's fiscal year 2025 budget. Although the economic picture of Ukraine I painted today may not be as bleak as one might expect more than 2 years into Russia's unyielding and brutal war, the experience of life under Ukrainian sky remains a nightmare. Just over a week ago, Russia struck a massive shopping center in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. The latest estimates suggest that nearly 20 people, including at least one child, were killed and scores were injured. Ukrainians live in fear of not coming home alive from a simple grocery run. As I mentioned, millions of Ukrainians fled the country to escape the horrible war. And some estimates suggest that as much as 10% of the pre-war population has not yet returned. First and foremost, Ukraine must, of course, be able to defend itself and fight Russia's aggression. But beyond that, our work on the economic front is aimed at sustaining strong growth, improving governance, supporting reforms, and fostering recovery and reconstruction. With stable economic conditions, my hope is that as many Ukrainians as possible can and do choose to go home.
Thank you for these remarks, Assistant Secretary. I think they were necessary because the heroism and the resilience of the Ukraine people and its economy, they are not that much in the public eye, and it's really important to point it out. And I agree with you that Ukraine deserves every help that they need. Now, the numbers are staggering. The fiscal deficit will be around 20% of GDP this year, which translates into about 3 to 4 billion in financial needs that Ukraine needs to be filled each month. To reduce these needs, you made some suggestions. You called for tariff increases in selected areas, revenue increases, other reforms. Will this be enough to cope with possible donor fatigue? And if the war goes on for longer, is this a viable strategy for Ukraine?
So Ukraine has devised its own national revenue strategy, and it contains a lot of important ideas that will help Ukraine in the future. It will help Ukraine in the short run, medium, long run, and should be done regardless of the current war footing. I also suggested and highlighted some areas that might be worth additional consideration given the current situation on the ground. But that said, as you described, there is going to be a large gap that will be required to be filled by international partners. Ukraine, as I mentioned, spends essentially all of its budget on its military effort right now. Right. So any extra needs, and those needs are essential. Again, as I mentioned, it's often overlooked, the importance of economic assistance. It's not as tangible as thinking about, let's say, weapons. But if you don't have an energy infrastructure, if you don't have schools and roads, if the government isn't functioning, Ukraine similarly will be completely unable to fight. So this is really important. I'm very proud of what the international community has done to marshal resources to support. So the European Union has offered several years' worth of very significant economic assistance. That's right. The United States just announced our $8 billion or so of economic assistance that I just mentioned. And together with the IMF program, with funds from other partners, and hopefully with the progress that we're making on some of the ideas related to unlocking the economic value of Russia's immobilized sovereign assets, together, hopefully we'll be able to support Ukraine in its very bold and heroic fight to defend itself.
Right. You mentioned and welcomed the role of the IMF in various places in your speech. Perhaps you could take us through again a little bit into how the IMF came in. For example, to get it on board, the US and other countries agreed to potentially large additional debt forgiveness, debt relief at the end of the program, conditional, potentially large. Why did you get to such lengths to get the IMF involved? And how, for example, given its relatively moderate amounts that it contributes itself, and how do you respond to critics that say a similar debt forgiveness effort should be also available to other countries, for example, in the developing world?
So the first thing I mentioned, which was, I think, an important initial step in the IMF's approach to Ukraine, was given the uncertainty on whether, in fact, economic policymakers could enact policies that affected the macroeconomy, that allowed the country to stay on a program designed with the IMF, given the uncertainty on whether you could do that in the middle of a hot war. The IMF started with a program that was not financed, involved no lending. It was this PMB that I referenced. And it was only when the Ukrainians demonstrated that they were able to perform quite well during that PMB that attention turned to a more traditional, an upper credit tranche program. Now, part of what changed in order to allow a program for Ukraine, an upper credit tranche program for Ukraine, is a new IMF policy on exceptional uncertainty. But without getting too into the weeds, into the details, the way I would think of it is all IMF programs must be financed. And for many cases, there's not such a level of uncertainty that the degree of those financing commitments need to be made conditional on the state of affairs. And there are other states of the world, or other types of programs or environments or countries where, in fact, you might need to do a little better. You might need to tailor the financial assurances that are offered to have not only a base case, but also a downside scenario. Right. And that, to me, is the crux of what was done here, is that financing assurances were asked not just over one base case, but over a base case and a downside. And certainly that applies to Ukraine, given the sort of dire risks associated with the war. But there's no reason why this doesn't better equip the IMF to handle any number of cases in the future. There's nothing that has to restrict this to be only applicable to war or Ukraine. I generally think it makes good sense to be able to say when there's a scenario where the membership is willing to provide financing assurances under various cases, and that's what's required to preserve and essentially put in safeguards for the IMF, it's a very natural way to proceed. And so very happy to have supported that, and I think those steps essentially allowed the IMF to move forward with Ukraine's program, which again has so far gone quite well.
Right. So in a sense, what I think you understood you were saying is that there are some risks that IMF conditionality can't address. For example, in this case, in Ukraine through the war, and some partners of Ukraine are ready to hold the IMF whole in case these circumstances come in, but they don't have to necessarily, of course. The program may as well just run in a normal way.
Again, financing assurances are always required to make sure all programs are financed, and the novelty here is the recognition that there might be different levels of financing required depending on some sources of uncertainty outside of the control of the authorities. And I assume that's what you're getting at when you say that conditions can't accommodate. And so it seems very natural to develop a technology that allows countries and programs in the IMF to move ahead in such a case. And this is, again, having the IMF's expertise in there, more than just the money, having them build a macroeconomic framework and help with monitoring. I think those are some absolutely essential parts of what the IMF has in fact contributed to Ukraine's ability to defend itself and manage its economy through a devastating war.
Right. And as you said, this facility is also available to other countries, of course, right? You quoted the World Bank estimate for the reconstruction costs after the war, and at the moment they are at about 500 billion, or about 2.5 times Ukrainian GDP. Again, a staggering number. Much of this will have to be financed by Ukraine itself at some point, but of course this could also kickstart the economy once the war ends. Now, you were very positive on many of the reforms that are happening. Do you think that the country is doing enough to prepare for this kind of end of the war and the reconstruction effort that comes? You seem pleased with the governance steps, for example, in the IMF program. But do you think there is more that eventually needs to be done to fight corruption? And what other reforms are needed to facilitate private sector investment? How can the U.S. help? Used
phrases like pleased or doing enough. I mean, just to be clear, it's a brutal, hot, very serious, very difficult time. Hot war, very serious war, very difficult time there. I'm impressed with what they're able to accomplish, but of course, the more that they can do for themselves, together with partners, for now, for the future, of course, the better. And part of what I think all these efforts, all this engagement from the international community is trying to do is to foster essentially an environment that's complementary to both domestic and foreign investments, since, as you described, sort of tremendous amounts will be needed. It's obviously quite difficult right now to expect certain kinds of investments, given the nature of the war. Others are more natural, but as the possibility to come in with different kinds of investments opens up, the international community can help by doing things like providing greater insurance, helping with insurance markets in areas where the private sector can't on its own bear those risks. And I described some of the efforts toward that end. We can do things like amplify some of the successes that existing private investments are having, which is one of the things, for instance, I tried to do just now. We can help coordinate conferences where potential foreign investors can learn about the opportunities and find partners that can help them better navigate any concerns or risks that they otherwise are being held back by. And lastly, the reforms that the Ukrainians are on their own pushing ahead with will hopefully, unlock their own domestic investments. I mentioned some of the statistics where Ukrainian businesses and Ukrainian entrepreneurs were shifting quite impressively to changes that this war requires their economy undergo and undertake. And that activity is exactly the sort of thing that I think will help propel growth once, hopefully, the war and the hostilities attenuate and end.
Now, you also talked about the need for a commercial debt restructuring of Ukraine. I mean, there's, of course, the official side, but there's also commercial creditors. How important do you think is a restructuring of that, which has to be done, I think, by August, because that's when the standstill agreement expires? How important is that to attract foreign investment again in Ukraine? Do you see this as critical? And the second question is, are you confident that an agreement will be reached eventually between Ukraine and its creditors in time?
I think this is an important step for Ukraine. It's an important part of their program with the IMF, and it's something that certainly we hope Ukraine and private bondholders and creditors make progress on. We won't and don't weigh in on the merits of any particular deal, but key elements of any agreed-to deal is that it returns Ukraine's debt sustainability or debt to sustainable, and that it's consistent with the parameters of the IMF program, and that it adheres to and respects comparability of treatment across other parts of the credit stack. But certainly I'm hopeful that they'll make progress and soon reach an agreement. One element of all that I mentioned in the speech is, part of the dynamic, of course, when you think about a negotiation between a creditor and a debtor, or creditors and a debtor, it is thinking through what is the source of the inability to pay, and how do you think about what that implies for the future. And I did want to emphasize that this is a case different from many cases in history where a country's own policies or its own policy making may very well have led to the fiscal stresses that cause bondholders not to be repaid. I do personally view this as a quite different scenario. Here's a scenario where, again, a hostile neighbor came and, through no fault of Ukraine's, invaded the country, and that's what led to the fiscal stress. So I'm hopeful that they'll be making progress.
On the corporate side, this is understood, yeah. Talking about some other possible ways for financing, the G7 is currently discussing options to utilize the blocked foreign exchange reserves of Russia, and you mentioned the European agreement. The US, I think, has tabled a proposal that these profits from the frozen assets could also be used to serve a loan that could be provided to Ukraine upfront. But this seems to have not met with the full agreement on the European side. Do you expect a decision at the G7 summit, which is the weekend after next?
Yeah, so I won't, the G7 summit, I think, on the 13th or 14th or so, I won't get out ahead of that. But just to sort of back up and again kind of explain sort of where this came about, Europe conceived of this very, I think, innovative, interesting, and important way to essentially, in the spirit of what the G7 leaders asked us to do, to find a way for Russia's immobilized sovereign assets to produce an economic benefit for Ukraine. And the way that they conceived of doing this actually in no way involves, for instance, seizing Russian assets. Right. It's about taking the interest revenues essentially earned off of those immobilized assets. And those interest earnings, those interest payments are not Russian. And so they've come up with this very fascinating proposal and made progress with it to steer those annual windfall proceeds toward Ukraine's benefit.
And they could be about 3, 4, 5 billion a year, right?
It depends on a number of factors, but one you can think of is the interest rate, the exchange rate, but that's in the ballpark of what we have in mind, that's right. And the conversations now include a number of options, but one option is yes, to put together in the short run lending that would be essentially paid back by those annual streams. It would simply be a matter of taking windfall profits, which would come over time, and bringing them forward so that they would benefit Ukraine in the very short run. Right. Since, again, Ukraine's short-run needs, per your question, are quite high. So I think we're making progress together with partners in thinking of ways, again, to build on this very important European step, and hopefully we'll be able to continue that progress and announce something.
Yeah. Now, your speech focused on Ukraine, of course, but we should also think about the Russian economy to some extent, because it is also, in a way, a conflict about whose economy can support a war for longer, perhaps. Now, Russia has been doing probably better than expected, despite all the sanctions in place. How do you explain this performance, and will Russia be able to sustain it?
So the first thing I would say is, it's hard to evaluate the performance of economies, particularly during war times when they've taken such steps to essentially transform their economies to support their war. So, for instance, one thing you may have in mind are forecasts of Russia's GDP. Right. But I don't view GDP growth in Russia as a particularly good metric for either the efficacy of sanctions efforts against Russia or for how their economy is performing in the sense of their ability to support a thriving middle class over the medium run or in fact to support a war effort over the medium or longer run. And the reason is, you typically think of the part of GDP that brings welfare, that makes people better off is consumption. And the part that really sets you up to be able to consume in the future is investment. And quite a lot of what Russia is now doing is either government spending directly associated with the war effort or a type of investment that's affiliated with future government spending on the war effort. So you can imagine scenarios where GDP, doesn't show any real decline or degradation in Russia's economic prospects, even though, in fact, that is the case. And that is my view, that we've, by forcing Russia essentially to make these trade-offs to shift resources toward the war effort and away from the production of consumption or investment goods, that their economy is being degraded, at least over the medium or the longer term. Another metric sometimes used to evaluate the Russian economy is the value of the ruble. But again, that's not, in my view, a very useful metric for sanctions. The ruble, for example, appreciated over a period of time when I think we were quite effective at keeping Russia from being able to source key foreign inputs. And the reason that might be consistent is with an inability to spend foreign currency on key inputs that you want, right, the demand for that foreign currency could go down, and that's an appreciation of the currency. The last thing I would say here is our efforts now really are focused on just making sure that we're doing all we can to keep Russia from being able to source inputs that essentially allow them to mobilize and build out their war effort. And we're finding that it's important to be able to target shipment of those inputs from other countries. So for instance, in December, the president signed an executive order that allows us to essentially target banks that facilitate transactions which supply Russia with the sort of inputs and dual-use items that they need for their war effort. And I'm very hopeful that as we continue our efforts to keep Russia from being able to access critical inputs into their military efforts, we'll succeed in impeding Russia's ability to continue fighting for very long.
Well, thank you for these answers, Assistant Secretary, again, and thanks for being here. And with this, I'm turning over to George Lipsky for a few final words.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Assistant Secretary. Thank you for being here. I want to thank everyone for joining us at the Atlantic Council in person and watching all over the world. Your detailed remarks, your unpacking of the status of the Ukrainian economy and what needs to be done, and as you said, the key defining international economic issue of President Biden's first term, I think you brought home to everyone here today how much support has been given and also how much support needs to be given to sustain Ukraine through this war effort. We at the Atlantic Council will continue to be a partner on that effort. On my behalf at the Geoeconomic Center, our partners in the Eurasia Center. On Friday, in fact, we will launch a new report in partnership with the Eurasia Center and the Global Energy Center on Ukrainian reconstruction. So this is an issue that is core to the work of the Council, core to our mission, and we appreciate you being here today, Assistant Secretary. We wish everyone a good rest of the day.